Uh,
Okay.
let's get started. However you want to do it. I don't know.
I'm gonna just do a quick, unrehearsed intro,
Sure.
and I'll call you in when it's time, and
Awesome.
it's not gonna be long at all, because is this just fantasy? And the answer is, of course, no. It is never just fantasy, ever.
No.
And I know this because I love fantasy, and I think you do too,
Oh, of course.
if I'm correct. So, first of all, I'm Dan, and that's all you need to know.
Yeah.
Well, by you, I mean not you who I'm talking to, but the people who may be listening ever. They don't need to know my last name, but they will hear it eventually. In fact, they'll probably know it before they listen to it, because it'll just be people who know me who listen to it. So,
That's how these
my
things go.
exactly, my cryptic nature is pointless. Um, but yeah, I'm Dan, and I love fantasy, and you are...
I'm Sean. I will also redact my last name for simplicity's sake. And I,
You
yeah.
can't say your last name.
I'm Sean Yeager. I love fantasy as well. And like Dan said, is this just fantasy? No, absolutely not. It's
It's
everything
never
in
just
between,
fantasy.
I would say. I'm looking at a list of things that I prepared beforehand and during as I'm speaking of subject matter that I feel like we're going to transition into during this discussion.
Probably, yeah. So I decided, because I just wanted to do this as, I guess, a series of recorded conversations, I guess you might want to call it, just because it's like, I like talking about it, and I don't get to talk about it enough, and I feel like I finally have some people I know who have, like, overlapping interests
Oh, yeah.
in this respect, and so I want to, I guess you could say, take advantage of that and be like, yeah, sure, I want to talk about stuff I like with
Totally.
people I think are interesting and have interesting things to say about it. Um, but I wanted to start this whole thing off by just talking about why I like fantasy,
Okay.
or why I like fantasy, and like origins of that. So rather than being like self-indulgent and just starting off by saying what I think, I'll ask you, what do you think first got you interested in fantasy, and when do you think that was?
Oh, man. Geez, so long ago. I mean, I feel like I was a kid, right? Like,
Right.
um, fantasy goes back. The origins of fantasy is, far before I was born, far before, most of us who are alive now were born. And there's so much appeal to it that is escapism for me, I guess. So when I first really started getting into it was like probably um, you know, obviously not preschool era. You're too young to kind of understand the nuances of fantasy, but like I would say middle school, probably like really just, everybody's all punk and grungy and nobody is really situated properly in their lives, right? And you're trying to
Right.
discover all this stuff about yourself, and so you kind of either, fall into the standard like, well, I'm just gonna kind of deal with this stuff, face on and live in the now and party my head off. But I was one of those reserved kids. I didn't want to go to the parties. I didn't want to do all that stuff. I was happy playing with like Legos and action figures and stuff, and all sorts of comics and pop culture references and things like that. So kind of the fantasy niche was started for me with Dungeons and Dragons and like role playing tabletop games. I was playing like
Wow.
Heroes Quest and stuff, and like King's Quest on like Macintosh back when we had an old like Mac computer. Even like probably my earliest memory of something that's like fantasy, even though it's not really superly considered fantasy, is like the old Mac game Lode Runner. Have you ever heard of that?
I never heard of Lode Runner. I have an old game in my like history that I was going to refer to, but what is that?
Lode Runner was this like side-scrolling. Well, I guess it wasn't even side-scrolling. It was just kind of like a 2D platformer where you were like a Tomb Raider adventurer type person, and you ran around and like, I mean, it was all pixelated. It was like, I don't know if it was like 16-bit or what, but it like you would
It's probably like 8-bit at that
yeah,
point.
honestly, yeah, I would say so. Like very, very simplistic, and the running animations were like 3 frames, but you would like shoot this ray gun and like destroy sand like either left or right of you, and then that would cause like holes to open up in the platformer, and then you could fall through the holes and like collect gold, and you had to fight these cultists while you were
Oh my
it was
god,
like super good.
that's amazing. I mean, when you said load runner, I was like, so you're running around collecting loads.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think you would
That
really
sounds
dig
like
it though. Yeah.
It's. I mean, I love everything I heard about it. Sounds fun. I like stuff like that. But it's funny
Totally.
you mention Legos, because that's what I was going to say. Is I think really, it honestly started for me with Legos, and specifically the medieval like kingdom. I think
Yeah.
that's the official title for it. The kingdom, the medieval knight specifically. Because we had a couple of those medieval knight Lego people with like the helmets and everything, and that alone I think is why I just got fixated specifically on medieval fantasy. I like fantasy of all kinds, and we can talk about the varieties of
Oh
such
yeah.
things, but I think my just because I could make up stories and like build my own castle, and then like there was also like a wizard Lego character,
Heck yeah.
and all that stuff, and I just my mind kind of really clung to it. I remember I really loved the little Lego swords and shields and stuff, and there was in the medieval set there was like they had these little shields with these different emblems on them, like, and there was like an eagle and a lion, and I remember there was a wolf one.
Oh my
And
gosh.
spoiler alert, everybody, my last name's Wolf,
We
and it
got to
factored
it.
very large into my childhood and my life generally. And so,
With a last name like Wolf, I mean that's like what is it? Like precognition, right? Like you end up having to kind of fall in line with that. It's your last name, right? Like
yeah, it's oh yeah, for sure. Well, it's funny because I remember when I went over to a grandparents' house, they would have like portraits of wolves up. Like I'm guessing, and it's one of those funny things where I used to joke around when because we did that at my house. I used to joke around when people would come over that like, oh, it's just extended relatives,
yeah.
from the family. And we even used to sign our name when it was like a collective, Wolves with a V,
Yes.
because we just go that way, even though that's not how you spell my name. But anyway, like yeah, like Lego for sure, and then there was a lot of movies and stuff when I was a kid, like stuff with magic in it, like Bedknobs and Broomsticks with Angela Lansbury, and and like a magic bed that flies around.
Oh
Like
yeah.
you can't get any more magical than that. But then like and of course like Disney movies,
Right,
like
right.
the classic princess movies, like specifically like Sleeping Beauty,
Oh yeah.
and that's because and it all really comes down to this. If I'm perfectly honest, it's dragons. That's really why
Yep.
I like fantasy. It's dragons. I made a note here, possibly through dinosaurs,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I love dinosaurs as a kid, like every kid does.
Well, that's like the binary
And
option, right? Like you have all the gender roles that our era grew up with of like, well, if you're a boy, you get the dinosaurs and the Legos and the
the trucks.
trucks and whatever. Yeah. So that's interesting. Would you say that like your like formative kind of timeline for growing up with fantasy was like similar to what I experienced with like high school and middle school era, or
Oh
even
no,
earlier?
I was very much younger. Like for me, like it's like I remember being fixated because we had in our old computer, we had it was the first video game I ever saw, or that I remember seeing, even though I believe we already had a Nintendo at that point. But I just kind of ignored that because it was a game I wasn't like capable of playing. But we had this is gonna sound ridiculous. It was a movie tie-in game to the Disney Black Cauldron movie, which I never saw, by
Yeah.
the way,
No,
until much later.
I've never seen
And
it.
I actually love. I think it's a cool looking movie, but it was the Black Cauldron DOS game, and it's very similar to how you're describing it, like the other game, except like it was like you were walking around with this 8-bit man and these horrible graphics, but like they would have like spooky trees, and there was like a dragon in it, and there was a pig you had to rescue, and it's one of those things where if you know the movie, it follows along with that and it makes sense. But it was one of those things where it was built in that era when if you read the booklet had absolutely no help for you whatsoever in terms of how you actually win the game, because it just started you off on a screen and you could like walk left or right, and then like you could either like, oh, if I go in here I can talk to this guy, but then he just says some weird thing and you don't understand, and then you walk to the other side and then you can like leave the farm, and it was just completely impenetrable, like in terms of like how you actually win. And like there was like apparently a bunch of secret shit where it's like if you go up to this tree and you hit this button, like a thing falls out of it, and then you have to go to this waterfall and play this song on this thing, and then the waterfall turns off and it turns into a whirlpool and you meet the witches, and it's like crazy.
Oh my gosh. See, like
it's
they don't make games like that anymore, right? Like
they don't, like, for good reason, because it's
see, yes, I on one hand, yeah, it is a good reason you shouldn't make games that just make no sense whatsoever, but like part of me misses that so much. Like
I do like the
there's so much nostalgia there,
discovery.
Right? Yeah, like the discovery and like the just like, and that was all pre-internet too, like not to be like so far down the rabbit hole, but like pre-internet you didn't have the ability to like go look up like, well, how do I unlock the secret of the tree?
How do I do it?
Yeah, you would go to school, or you would go to like, you know, your neighbor's house on the weekend and play the game for like 4 hours and maybe figure it out. But you would say, oh my gosh, dude, like last night I was playing, you know, like Dragon's Lair or like something, and I found a weird room, and like I don't know how I got there. I'm gonna have to do it again tonight. Like
it's well, I mean, even related to that, like when I finally did start paying attention to like the Nintendo we had, I definitely got fixated because I like Mario.
Oh yeah.
Mostly because like, oh, there's cool monsters in here, and like there's a dragon that you fight with a big turtle shell, and I like turtles. But then we didn't have the Legend of Zelda. We had a Link, the second one, and I just remember I liked that one just because you could. Again, it was like related to the little Lego man and his sword. It was just like, oh, it's this cool little adventure that you went on, and you know, and then that just funneled into things like, like watching Disney movies as a kid and just really liking, you know, like The Sword and the Stone. Because like, oh cool, there's a wizard in it and a witch, and they turn into shit, and like it was just fun. Big into like King Kong, like that was like my favorite movie as a kid. You know, very fanciful. I think like the first books I read were like, you could probably call them magical realism, where it was like, even though the main point of of it was like this fanciful thing, it's still mostly about regular people, like the Littles, if you've ever heard of them.
I don't think I have.
It's basically the Borrowers, and I don't know which one stole from what, but the Borrowers I think is a British one, and the Littles, it was these little tiny people that had these little tails.
Ooh.
And and then it was like also at the same time read like Stuart Little, you know, and so it was just like I just like anything that was imaginative. And then the real big turnaround for me was 5th grade, and that's because in the same year I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
I read the first of the Chronicles of Prydain books, which are some of my favorite books when I was a kid. That's where the Black Cauldron comes from.
Cool.
It was the Book of Three was the first one, and then I also read The Hobbit.
Yeah.
It was the same year, 5th grade, and that's what hooked me. And so then that's why a few years later, my sister knew to give me Harry Potter.
Right.
Because I remember I was 11 years old when I got the first one, and that was like when it was first getting popular, and she was like, I think you'll like this. I heard it's good. You better tell me if it is. And then, but then I just started reading a bunch of fantasy books, like the Dragonlance books, which I cannot speak for their you know, literary value at this time, but I remember I loved them at the time. And this is all, I never played like Dungeons and Dragons. Like I had heard of it, but it was one of those things where it's like you need friends for that, and I don't have those, so
Right.
I need to one player it by reading these books, and
Mm-hmm.
then I read like Lord of the Rings and all that shit. So it was, yeah, it was just a cataclysm of fantasy shit at a certain point.
Totally. That, I mean, speaking of books, like I guess my like formative books for beginning to love fantasy were, you know, lower reading comprehension. Like definitely earlier than middle school for me. Like I would listen to my mom read Harry Potter, and like we
Mm.
would go on these big long road trips, and she would read, you know, the whole book. It would be like an 8 hour road trip, and she would just like word for word read the whole book out loud to us while we were in the back seat. And like I was really young at that point, so you know I didn't get uh like the full story. I didn't understand most of it, but it was definitely like imprinting like the bias of loving fantasy into my younger brain that would then go on to like seek out that type of media, right? Like I read The Iron Giant, which was like very like mythical fantasy, right? Like
Oh
there's
yeah,
this
yeah.
like, you know, giant and a princess and like a golden orb, and the giant is this like green man from like, you know, Celtic mythology and stuff. So like mythology played a big role for me too in getting into
Yeah.
fantasy. And like I remember playing like Age of Empires and like Age of Mythology, and like just
Age of
learning.
Mythology,
Oh,
baby.
dude, it ruled. It was so good. I need to get it again. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just like, you know, if you list out all the things that were like the formation of my love for fantasy, it's like games, and it's just books and television and movies and like literature and like poems. I mean, it just like there's so many different forms of media that constitute what fantasy is to me. And so like nowadays, like, as you know, I mean, you're a creator, and so like myself as a creator, like I want to kind of embody all of those mediums and like put forth fantasy work that kind of like is all encompassing of how fantasy can be represented, because that's how I loved learning about it growing up. um, and like just being able to kind of do justice to what I remember, and being like lighthearted is really important to me too, for like for reading fantasy and understanding fantasy, because I don't want, I mean, you know, The Hobbit and like Lord of the Rings and the like what am I trying to say, the begrudgery, I guess, like of the deep like feudal kind of uh you know world changing, world shattering kind of consequences of a dragon or a gigantic tower that can see you in the darkness, and like just, you know, all the allegory is a lot in fantasy, and sometimes I just like to consume silly fantasy. um
No, I think that's one of the things that I really like about it, is that it's, you can come at it from a playful side of things,
mhm.
and from like a like serious, like very much like a mythological literary, like direction. But I mean, when you talk about like Tolkien and his, like, well, first of all, Tolkien is responsible unintentionally for the size of the paperback fantasy section of every bookstore
Yep.
and library, because, and it was one of those things where I read, oh fuck, it was like, maybe it was like, I think it might be in the first of the, like the Shannara books. It was
Yeah.
either Shannara or it was like the Terry, or it was like, I think it was Terry Brooks. um, and I just remember reading it, and I was like, oh my god, like even as a kid I was like, this is the exact same plot as Lord of the Rings, but he's trying to do it in one book.
Yeah.
Because it was, but then that was when the veil started to fall, and I started noticing, like, oh, like so many fantasy stories since Tolkien have basically said, well, there's a dark lord and there's a thing he wants, and it's bad if he gets it, and he's got a bunch of bad like underlings, and the good guy is trying to get the thing before they get the thing, and
Yeah.
like that's basically the plot, and then they have to either use the thing to destroy the bad guy, or they destroy before the bad guy can use it. And that's like 80 to 90% of like all fantasy fiction that's been made since the end of Return of the King.
Yeah.
So and it's because it's like, oh man, like I mean, to me it's like Tolkien is like the gold standard of like that type of story.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree that like I there's times where it's like, I don't need a world ending event to feel invested, you know.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it was written during a time when there was a lot of world-ending events, like
Mm-hmm.
world wars and shit. So
Yeah.
it's like it felt very pressing. And honestly, rereading it this at this time, I would probably feel like, wow, this feels relevant. You know?
Yeah.
We're in a small number of people are in a desperate bid to save the world from
Yeah.
itself.
Yes, yeah.
You know,
That's
about
like
that.
yeah, that's the whole idea behind the escapism of fantasy, right? Like sometimes
Oh, yeah.
you wanna just kind of use it as a catharsis and get out your emotions and your feelings with a story that has parallels to your reality, but not necessarily limited by the the constraints of what you're able to do in your own daily life. Like that's the magic of fantasy and like the superhuman kind of abilities and senses. But yeah, for me it's just being able to like indulge myself in something that isn't my life, that isn't what I'm doing right now on a daily basis of waking up and coding at a computer and then making dinner and like I get it. That's fine. That's life for everybody, but like I love being able to kind of whisk myself away or even daydream. I'm a huge daydreamer. Like just I mean that's building worlds and universes and lore and content was a consistent thing in middle school and high school in my adult life.
Oh, yeah.
Like yeah, I mean
the first stories I ever wrote were fantasy stories, or actually
Same.
technically I would call them mythology, because I remember, funny enough, okay, so in 8th grade, my grade school, which is the same grade school that all my siblings went to,
mm-hmm.
there was a project in 8th grade where it was like you were learning mythology, and we had Edith Hamilton's Greek mythology that we read through, and I remember I fucking loved it. I adored mythology. I still do.
Yeah.
And the goal at the end of the class was you got this little like bound book. It's like the size of like one of those little golden books. But I remember it was like all white cover and like completely blank pages, and like not even lined paper. And the last project was you need to write a myth that, and because in that early days it was like myths explain some sort of natural phenomena in some way, or like why some object exists or why certain things happen.
Yeah.
And so you need to have that element to it and incorporate the gods in some way. And I remember when my brother wrote his, he asked me to help him come up with it. And so like he like was he would like say like, give me some of your toys so that I can draw them, because you had also to do illustrations.
Yeah.
And so he took a bunch of like my Power Ranger toys and he took like one of those, and then like this like snake dude,
mm-hmm.
and then this like tiger man.
Yep.
And he had all these funny names for them. And I just remember like years later when I read it, I'm like, Dave, like this is a terrible story that doesn't make any sense. And he's like, I was in 8th grade. What do you want? And then I did mine in 8th grade, and it was this project I took the most seriously and earnestly, and crafting my own myth and stuff like that. And I remember my teacher, when she handed it back to me, she was like, you should do this. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she's like you should write and like tell stories and draw pictures for them. And it's one of those things where I think back and it's like she was basically telling me to make comics, which is what I do now. And so I just find that really fascinating that like even that at that point I'm like I took it seriously,
Right.
I guess, and like even in a fun way, because it was like this Greek soldier, and he like gets special armor from Hephaestus or something like that, and like does a thing. It was more like a Greek, like a Perseus kind of story, or a Theseus kind of story, rather than like a Demeter is sad because her daughter's getting raped.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Winter, which, sorry, fans of that recent, like, webcomic that is, like, trying to recontextualize Greek mythology to where it's, like, they're, like, in high school or something, and it's really pretty. Crap, I forget what it is. But it's retelling the Persephone myth.
Are you talking about Olympus lore? Or Lore Olympus, or what, or maybe?
No, it's a comic. It's like a web comic. I think it was on Webtoon.
Yeah,
And
it's like, are they all pink? Like Persephone is like just
yeah,
pink, and
that's
then
the
like
one.
all yeah, that's
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 it.
Lore Olympus or Olympus lore or something like that.
I think it's Lore Olympus. I think you're right. Yeah, yeah. That. Yeah, I'm sorry, fans of that, but that's you know, there are famous statues called the Rape of Persephone for a reason.
Yeah, and like, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the ugly, the ugly truths, right? And like all these concepts of fantasy are all nowadays, I guess, more limited and structured by this whole like bias of what's PC, and like and I totally agree with it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you don't
No,
want
I'm fine.
to,
No, yeah, I'm
like,
fine.
yeah, step on anybody's toes, or like people are sensitive nowadays, and so you want to avoid, like, including content that could be like traumatic or whatever. But like at a certain point too, like um that's like how a lot of old fantasy work, I mean, especially like in the era of the 90s and like the like even earlier, like 80s and stuff, with all like the sci-fi, right? And like science fantasy, even with like Star Wars, and like the idea that like a woman is like the damsel in distress or whatever, and like that like whole like misconstrued
The whole,
conception, like, right?
no,
Like,
there's so yeah, like, yeah, there's a lot to be said about like tropes in fantasy, and how for a long time, and even still to this day, there's a lot of like just like not particularly pleasant characterizations and of types of people.
yeah.
Again, yeah, classic things like damsels in distress and stuff like that, which is funny because it's like when you look, even like go pretty far back, it's like there's very few examples of that in, like, say, folk tales, even, which I
Yeah.
love folk tales, but because like you look at like one example is like Sleeping Beauty.
Mm-hmm.
But even Sleeping Beauty, like, it's like a weird set of circumstances, and actually most of the story is about her,
Yeah.
like, and she's just basically left up there for like 100 years until somebody's like, I'm gonna go over there, and he's just the one meant to do it.
Sure.
But like, for the most part, yeah, it's like it's filled with like plucky characters who like need to either figure out their situation, or they're just the lucky person who is supposed to do it, which
And
is
like
a whole thing.
whole thing. And like it all makes you think about the context in which like a story is told, or not even necessarily restricted to fantasy, but like take like the Grimm fairy tales, or like even German fairy tales, which are fantasy, of course, but like the morality and the messages that are put inside of these stories are usually like cautionary tales, or like some kind of like
Mm-hmm.
just overarching message of like, if you do this will happen, and like it's a set of guidance or rules, whereas like I don't perceive Western fantasy, or like just like more fantasy content that I'm accustomed to, like Lord of the Rings. Like, of course, it's like got the biblical references, right? Like, and like all of these kind of like drawing upon other media, and like I'm kind of rambling here, but like the concept of Shakespearean like like plays and playwrights, and like and storytelling, kind of being able to condense any story back down into like a Shakespearean trope, or arc,
Mm-hmm.
and like you take that and perceive creative content through that lens, like of course you're going to have repetition, of course you're going to have tropes that you adhere to, but like it's so interesting to like read work that I read when I was in middle school now. Like I was pretty obsessed with Piers Anthony. Are you familiar with his work?
Oh yes, Piers Anthony. Yeah.
And just like I mean
Let's.
the dude named his series after himself. Like the whole
Yep.
Xanth like arc, which is like 90 books or some stupid crap like that. Like he wrote 90 books under the pseudonym or under like the name Xanth, which is just like his high school nickname because his friends called him Xanth because his first name is Piers and then last name is Anthony. Like, and he just took
yeah.
the Xanth in the middle, made a series out of it, and he's just some white dude that's like writing this damsel in distress, like
don't you? And, okay, this is a thing that I've mentioned before to other people, possibly, maybe even to you.
Yeah.
Do you remember how he used to have a map inside his book?
Yeah.
Of Xanth.
Yep.
What was the map of?
Oh, geez. I
It's
can't.
Florida.
Is it Florida? I don't. Oh my gosh, it is
It
Florida.
It's 100% Florida. The the magical land of Xanth, where the only place in his world where there is magic is Florida.
Yeah,
literally,
that's.
it is just a map of Florida.
I never realized that it is a peninsula, isn't it? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I remember. Well, I got this just on a little tangent with those books. I read the first one. I gotta say, honestly, by accident.
Yeah.
Because I was in grade school. I was like in 7th grade or 6th or 7th grade, and it was the Scholastic Book Fair, or like or I don't even know if it was the book fair, but it was like those order forms you would get that had like order these books, and it was like in the like if you read Harry Potter section.
Yeah, right.
Or like it was in the like if you like Narnia or something like that, and it was the first one of those books. And I guess I convinced my mom to buy it for me. There's a lot of shit in there that a 6th grader shouldn't be reading.
No. Piers
There's
Anthony's just full-blown smut. He's just writing smut, fantasy smut, and it's like absolute, like, I just
wish
like, I can't, yeah, total wish fulfillment. And like,
which is a factor of fantasy.
Huge factor of fantasy. But you're reading that as like a middle school student, and you have that like experience of like, oh wow, I don't think I should be reading this, but like,
right, I still did.
Yeah, of course you do, because you're like, wow,
I was getting away with something.
Absolutely, that's every middle school kid's dream. My mom bought me this book. Yeah, I am allowed to read this book. My mom got it for me, of course.
But like with just going to how like there's like a continuum of fantasy from like like folklore and stuff, and even how you were mentioning that there's a teaching or a morality play kind of component to say like folk tales, and there's say less of that being, or less that 1-to-1 in like more modern fantasy. That's one of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about is that there's a lot of people who back, and I'm just going to use Tolkien just because he's the guy who made fantasy a genre into itself, because it was basically, there's fairy stories, which mythology was considered fairy stories, or folk tales, and then there was serious literature. And like any other, and there was nothing else in between. There was like penny dreadful trash, and then there was the people who were skating on the margins, like Robert Louis Stevenson and Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who were just like we're doing like fantasy stuff in here, but we're not considered fairy stories. And Tolkien was like, I'm going to use mythology and we use folk tales and stuff to tell a sincere story, like, or do it sincerely, and because I have respect for these things. I have respect for fairy stories, for King Arthur and stuff like that, which wasn't considered legitimate. It was just like they made books for young boys that were like collections of like King Arthur and Robin Hood stories. And so I guess that all comes into this, like, there's still people who think like, oh, fantasy's for kids. Like, as an example, and I'm not going to call out this person's name, but no, I'm not. So a few years ago, Shape of Water came out, and it was it was my favorite movie of that year. I absolutely adored it. It won the Oscar for Best Picture, whatever that means. It doesn't, it doesn't increase me liking it or whatever. I just adored it, everything about it. And a friend of mine, who's a cinephile, like without a doubt, he loves movies. When after he'd seen it, he basically was like, it should have been a kids movie. Like, and take out the sex and like just make it like, and she loves the fish man, like in a cute way, like it's like, and he just basically thought like it was ludicrous. And that's to me an example of how a lot of people feel about fantasy as a genre, specifically like fantasy that includes like magic and possibly like a setting that is non-current.
Sure.
Like because like sci-fi, okay, that gets a pass. That can be cool by modern standards, let's say.
So like,
but.
So there's this cognitive dissonance that people are doing, right? They're like bouncing their thoughts around and saying like, oh yeah, science fantasy, that's fine, that's science. It can be its own thing, like, and it can be for adults because it's of the actual world. But the moment that you start to do like make believe, right, like fantasy or like anything that's like not empirical, like I mean even comics, like in the era of like pulps and things like that, with being well that's kiddie stuff, and then there was like the whole termite comic, like Arcrum, like edgy slash like diary comics, and like just creating experiences and telling your tale as a comic. And like, I mean, people have always sought imaginative content as like childish and have always seen it that way, and like there's always going to be that portion of the world that like perceives things as lesser or like a lowbrow form of art, and fantasy still gets that, I mean, for sure. I don't know.
It's definitely considered like a lesser kind of storytelling, or lesser genre. And because like, oh, it's silly, or it's whatever, and then like it's just interesting to me that like people can be like, oh well, like lightsabers and space wizards, that's okay, but like real swords and like mystical, like, and like grounded wizards or medieval wizards, no, you can't do that. It has to be a space wizard. Has to be a lightsaber. Right, yeah, like it has to be in a spaceship, can't be flying on a dragon.
Whatever. I mean, Game of Thrones.
Whatever.
And like.
Well, that's
like,
Game of Thrones. See, the thing is, Game of Thrones came around, and I think the reason that worked for people, and I've said this a number of times, is I think that worked for a general audience who normally wouldn't be into fantasy.
Yeah.
Because the most fantastic thing that happened in the first season was there was exactly one zombie in the first episode. And there were 3 baby dragons at the very last one of the first season, and that was it. And then for a long time it was just like the fantasy elements would creep up slowly until by the end you had tons of full-blown dragons and zombies and like men getting resurrected somehow. Like there might be gods in this universe, or maybe not,
and there's like
fairy people.
You have all the front loading, right? The front loading of all the drama and like the adult content and like the smart,
the historical
content,
epic,
and like empirical, like this happened, then this happened, and like you can't refute it because it's just a mundane thing that happens in the normal world. I'm gonna stab this guy, he's gonna die. I'm gonna arrow this person and they're gonna die. Like whatever. Like, sure, that's exciting. That's an action movie at that point, or an action series, and
or a
then
drama, or
yeah,
whatever. Yeah, like
and
I think that's what drew people who normally aren't into fantasy, is because they stuck all the fantasy stuff in the back, and everything else was like, oh, I'm just watching like a period show
yeah,
about a period that didn't happen, essentially.
like, that's not a fix. That's not a fix for fantasy. Like, not a win, I would argue. Like, definitely, like, Game of Thrones, like, opened up fantasy.
It's barely a win.
Barely a win. Like, it got fantasy in front of more people that normally wouldn't see it, but it's not presenting fantasy in what it should be, in my opinion. Like, the glory of it. Yeah, like...
here's the thing, though, and this is something that I'm going to be saying a lot when I have conversations with people, and that's, you vote with your money, and so I have to buy every single fantasy thing that comes out, even if it's not very good. Like, I paid money to see that Guy Ritchie King Arthur movie a couple years ago.
Sure.
I didn't want to, but you have to tell Hollywood somehow that you want more fantasy.
And it's the money.
Hey, but hey, when it's good, oh boy, do I sink money in it. I went to see Gretel and Hansel last year, 3 times in the theater, and that's hard to do in 2020. But it came out early enough in the year that I saw it 3 times in the theater.
For posterity, 2020, the Great Plague.
That was last year.
Third Great Plague, second Great Plague. I don't know, but yeah, we've been stuck inside. We're still inside.
We're still inside. That's why we're not talking in the same room.
Yep.
Surprise, surprise. But like, yeah, when it's really good, like, that was my favorite movie last year. But that's because I love folk tales and stuff. But you gotta vote somehow.
Yep.
With your, and you vote with your money when it comes to, like, media, which is why these days, anytime there's a fantasy comic, I buy it.
Yep.
For the most part, unless it's like terrible. Because then I'm not going to buy 50 issues of something that I don't like.
Right.
I'm not that stupid. There's a reason that I stopped reading Spider-Man for a while. It's because, I don't really like Dan Slott that much. And also, I don't really like this artist. I'm not going to read it. Yep. And I did it, and I felt better because I wasn't reading something I didn't like.
Oh, yeah, that's it. That's the key, is buy things you like, and then hopefully you'll see more of them. That's why, I mean, anytime that anybody tells me that they pirate things, I'm like, you gotta
cool,
watch out.
You're not supporting that thing existing.
Yeah. Okay, well,
or the people who made it. And it's one of those things where I get people saying, like, support, like, a big evil corporation, like this company or whatever, and it's like, I hear you. Yeah. I hear you, but unfortunately they have the money because they're big and evil. And the only way us little people, like us little artist types, can get the money is if we do something that they are willing to produce, you know?
Exactly.
And that's the shitty way that the world works. There's occasional times where, like, from the ground up something's made. There's a few movies that I know of that I like that were crowdfunded kind of things, like and some that, like, look like they're crowdfunded but they're somehow not. But no, fantasy, it's something that sticks close to me and I still find interest in, and that's just because, as somebody who makes stuff, somebody who creates fantasy, it allows me to be as creative as I possibly can be, because like when you create your own world, it's like, cool, what kind of animals do I want to have in there, and I can be as, like, connected to biology as I want, and I usually am because I love biology, and it's like I like stuff that seems plausible. But then if I want to have something that's just completely unrealistic and ludicrous, but it's fun and it looks cool, I can do that too. Yeah.
And I mean, we bring up Tolkien, right? We bring up Tolkien a lot in this episode, but like, I mean, the guy got, like, a minor or major in, like, architecture or something just to write the books. Like, I mean, guy, I mean, he's the gold standard again when it comes to, like, world building, because he had a detailed history of the world before he was, like, putting shit down about it.
Like it was funny because like I saw a meme, because memes are things that
Yeah.
people talk about, and it was like, I think it was like a picture of like maybe J.K. Rowling or something, and it was like, I came up with this fantasy world or whatever, and then like, and then it was like George R. R. Martin, and he was like, I came up with like a language, like and feudal system, like in my fantasy world, and Tolkien's was like, I invented like a whole family of languages and decided to write a story about it.
Yeah.
And that's because like, yeah, the like in some of these cases the language came first for him,
Yeah.
which is just amazing to me. And it's like, well, and it's well, so he's responsible, just to offshoot, because why not?
Yeah.
He's responsible for the preservation of two major works of like Northern European English literary history, which are Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Really?
Yeah,
How?
he. So it was one of those things where he was at the university at the time, and it was basically there was a debate going on whether or not these things were worth studying in any
Wow.
respect, like anthropologically or literarily. Like it was just
Yeah.
one of those things where like, oh, there's just this a couple scraps of a story here and there, and he was like, no, these feed into like the myths of the culture, and the myths of the culture teach us about the values of the culture, and like
Wow.
what they think and how they feel about things. And so we have Beowulf because he was like, no, we should study this and learn everything we can about our history through it. And the same thing for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Yeah.
There's even a version of that story that he, I guess you could say, edited, or wrote. You could say
Yeah.
he wrote a version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that is probably the best literary version. But yeah, like, anyway,
So
he's somebody who saw the anthropological importance of myth and fairy tales and fantasy.
wow. So I mean, like, I guess full circle then, right? Like as fantasy creators, we are driven by a necessity to kind of make the mundane more fantastical, right? I mean, like, the definition of fantasy is to create a world that is fantastical, and I mean, Tolkien certainly did that with just the ideas of the wars of his era, and being able to kind of turn them excuse me, turn them into like a grand epic that spans multiple books and multiple different degrees, and then he goes on to kind of like always put that back into the mundane and into the real world, right? Like, I mean, if he's like preserving like this like old content in the hopes that it enlightens us on previous cultures or like anthropologies, like, I mean, dang, dude, that's the dream, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
crazy.
it's fantastic, just because he was somebody who he valued the place that myth had in culture, and so like, just speaking from like just what fantasy, stuff that there's now tropes in fantasy like dwarves, elves, like, magic weapons, dark lords, mystical objects. That all came from, folk tales and myths that he studied, and like, a lot of people say like, oh, well, elves and dwarves, these come directly from Norse mythology. No, they don't. Like, dwarves and elves in Norse mythology, and trolls in Norse mythology, those are very different from the fantasy creatures that you and I and many other creators play around with, when we are like telling our stories.
Definitely.
They didn't come fully formed. He had to. He's the one who kind of developed the culture of these things, and then ever since then, everybody who's written about a dwarf or an elf is using a Tolkien orc or dwarf. Orc or dwarf. He also came up. he came up with orcs too, which is, playing around with goblins.
Yeah.
Which I just find just fascinating.
Love goblins.
And all this stuff. Yeah, it's fascinating because he gets all this stuff from folklore and turns it into something else, and then everybody's like, yes, we want this. And so now, you play Dungeons and Dragons, and a goblin runs around or orc comes around. It's like, well, it's a Tolkien thing, or it's probably modified at this point.
Yeah,
because there's plenty of examples of people like oh, elves are, some people think elves think Christmas elves,
right, yeah,
or Keebler elves or something.
Yeah, living in trees and whatever. And I mean, like the Scoia'tael elf from like The Witcher and stuff, just like forest guys with pointy ears. It's like, okay, I mean, it could be so much more. It could be more than that. And like as a devil's advocate, right? Like, Tolkien is the gold standard. Tolkien has these concepts that present themselves in other fantasy media very synonymously, and we have all these iterations of elves or orcs or goblins or whatever that like resemble the Tolkien kind of creature,
Mold.
Yeah, the mold, exactly. And on the other hand, there is a lot of like homebrew stuff in Dungeons and Dragons that people are pushing towards, that I think like the future of fantasy is going to be very, very rich, just because we've adopted kind of these ideas, right? In Tolkien's time, things were very different, and some 20, 30 years ago or whatever, like having all this content being written in the era, and then now 30 years later, we have all this content that is like, adopting the new ideal of like human rights and like racial rights, even like there's all these huge things going around, like with predetermined racism in Dungeons and Dragons, with like a race being predeterminately evil is racist inherently, and like just like that's crazy to me, like that we've come that far.
That's what's lovely, is that it's one of those things where, but I that like I think the future in fantasy is stuff that is both reflective of our times, but also like taking the things that were imaginative 70 years ago, 100 years ago, and doing something completely different with them, or reinventing them, or coming up with something brand new. I mean, brand new in quotes, because there's nothing new,
right?
But
Shakespeare, whatever.
but there's plenty of fascinating like creatures that exist in D&D that like were completely unthought of, prior to that. And there's just it's just fun. There's lots of fun, expansion on myth and folklore, and even like the foundations of fantasy that I think are great. As far as like, oh, this race is always evil. Like, that's fucked up. But I will say that I'm it's hard for me to go back and read, say, The Fellowship or something like that, and like think like, oh, I'm gonna take Tolkien to task for, because like all the orcs and stuff are evil, and it's like, well, that's like from a thematic standpoint, they are
right.
Like it's a representation of anybody who goes along with this, like, you could say, that Sauron is this kind of fascistic figure.
Sure.
And it's like, it's the people who go along with it and are like, I'm going to benefit from this.
Right.
And so it's meant to be symbolic, but once you take it away from Tolkien, and other people are like, oh yeah, there's the evil orcs or goblins, and then there's the good elves or whatever, and it's like, or like elves
without the symbolism, like, it's, I mean, you're just labeling a race as evil, like that's not kosher. Like,
it's not charitable. I mean, and it's one of those things where, like, for me as a creator who uses things like elves and goblins and stuff like that, like specifically with goblins, like my mind was like, okay, why does everybody think they're evil? Because I can build a world in which like people have that view, but it is still problematic even then. And so it's like, oh well, if maybe people are judging them by how they look, that helps. But then it's like, because they're being judged by how they look and pushed outside of society, and not even able to like have space of their own, like their society, they have to be able to provide for themselves, and so they maybe out of necessity develop this like rating culture.
Yeah.
Like they have to, because it's the only way that they can survive. And so that's another reason people hate them, is because, oh, they come and they steal stuff, or they come and they rob and stuff, and it's like, fuckers, this is all we can do.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, exactly.
like, yeah. So like that's where my mind goes, is it's like, okay, and then like, yeah, I don't know, it's just, like, it's a fun playground to deal with.
Totally. Like from that perspective, from what you described, like you're lending humanity to a non-human race, and that's, I guess, the most important thing to do, right? Is take the concepts of humanity, because you wouldn't persecute a man who steals bread to feed his family. Like, I mean, that's definitely a concept that has happened, you know, often and a lot in media, is like, oh, well, if someone steals and they're stealing for a right cause, is it bad, right? And right. That whole, you know, societal structure is so messed up, and we recognize that as humans, and I think that recognizing it even in fantasy is a good thing moving forward in fantasy, and I see more people doing it, and more, I mean, I've been watching tons and tons of TV shows and even anime, and like I started watching Attack on Titan the other day, and it's insane, feudal, like shadow government like concepts, and they do a really good job of like pitting people against each other, but not for like unexplained reasons. And I get like that's the trouble, is this race is evil, and we're not going to explain why someone perceives them as evil. They are just always evil. And fantasy deserves better. Fantasy can do better. But I'm not persecuting past concepts. Yeah. Like, you know, it's all just a lens that you read something through, and any individual can read something through their personal, you know, viewpoints. And I enjoy a lot of old fantasy. I enjoy new fantasy, and even more obscure stuff. I mean, I'm still gonna read a Piers Anthony novel. Like I don't care. I mean, I look at it through the lens that it is, but.
No, there's plenty of examples of stuff where it's like, okay, I could, like, I don't know if I'll be into that anymore. Like, there's, like, again, plenty of, like, cheap fantasy from back in the day that, you know, it's the formulaic, you know, I would say, like, the Conan mold of, this big barbarian guy, you know, and he's got, you know, slaves around him, you know, slave chicks or whatever. And it's, like, that's something that, hey, that's... Why is this a thing? Why is this just a thing in the world where, like, you know, oh, like this guy that you're friends with, he's a slave trader, you know, it's just his job. And it's like, oh, we're just gonna
gloss right over that one.
That one, huh? Okay. Yeah. Like, no, yeah, like there's a lot of that stuff in there, and it's like, oh man, like that's so like there's definitely stuff that in like an old fantasy art, which I love fantasy art.
It's great
from all eras, but like there's plenty of shit that's like, okay, can we dial back a bit? On the size of people proportions.
Yep, most certainly.
It's, it's a bit much.
Yep,
but no, it's something that I love. It's part of
it's part of the history. You got to know it to not repeat it.
Exactly, or to improve upon it. Is there any kind of fantasy that you don't like? I mean, we sort of mentioned bits, like parts of it, but like, is there any kind of like genre that you're not into?
Wow, that's a question. I love vanilla fantasy. I love science fantasy, Star Wars. I even love science fiction, not necessarily fantasy, but like, I guess like, I'm not a big fan of like science fantasy when it leans so far into itself, like that it just discredits the audience as like able to understand things, where it's like front loading all of the content and like like immediately starts referring to like Xenon 6 as like the blah 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 whatever planet that has and like, uh take Old Dune for example, like the
Right.
original, it might be Jodorowsky's, I don't know, uh where the
You talking about
intro,
you talking
um
about the David Lynch.
David Lynch, yeah, David Lynch's
David Lynch. Yeah,
version.
Jodorowsky didn't get to make his.
He didn't make his, but David Lynch's, yeah, where the scene opens up and the woman says, starts talking about the spice melange, and then she's like disappears and fades out, and then fades back in, and is like, "Oh, I forgot to tell you," and it's like, "Are you kidding me?" Like,
Yeah, no,
that's
there's yeah.
ugh, like when it's
It,
so
yeah,
far up its own butt, I can't handle that.
yeah, it's insufferable fantasy is what we'll call that.
There you go.
See, it's funny for me. It's a simple answer, and it's one of those things where I can't even say in every case that I don't like it, but I want to say in most cases I don't, and it is urban fantasy is the term that publishers will use to describe it, and it's basically fantasy in a modern setting.
Ooh.
It's like wizards in modern day wearing regular clothes and
Oh.
all that shit.
Like
I'm not
Bright
into-
on
and
Netflix.
yes, like that. Well, it's funny because like one of my favorite book series ever, Harry Potter, you could call that urban fantasy.
Yeah.
The reason that gets a pass, and it's not just because I read it as a kid, but it's because the wizarding world is still medieval.
Yeah.
Specifically, like it's like everything in it is still medieval. When you're in the wizarding world, you're picturing a wizard world, and occasionally a car shows up, but it's fun, but or train or whatever, or some weird device. But that's one of the reasons why I'm disappointed with the movies, is because they're like, hey, remember when they used to look like wizards? Never mind.
Never mind.
Never mind that.
Oh, you want to know what?
Yeah, but
This is reminding me. You said mechanical like devices. I would say that I'm not a huge fan of steampunk, and I guess that would be
Steampunk?
the type of fantasy, right?
I would say so. Yeah, it's an aesthetic for sure. What's funny is that that's one of those things that's like never really caught on, even when like, 'cause it's funny, like the one example of a steampunk movie I can think of is like Wild Wild West.
Yep.
and there you go.
Sorry, Will
And
Smith. Sorry.
sorry guys, but no, but I think part of it, because I would agree with you. I feel like it's not my favorite. I think there's some things aesthetically that you can do with it that's fun, and weirdly enough, I've been theorized that the best way to do, if you were to do a live action Mario movie, is that's how you would do it.
Ooh.
Because you could combine the technological stuff of like a dirigible and the plumbing and
Holy
like
moly.
cannons and stuff with the like feudal look of things.
Wow. Okay, you just like flipped my whole world upside down. If we get a steampunk Super Mario movie, I'm into it. I'm so into it.
That's 100% the only case where I could see like, yeah, steampunk would work then. I also years ago came up with this idea for like a steampunk like superhero story, but eventually abandoned it because I think it was after I saw Wild Wild West, and it was before I realized it was a bad movie, and I was like, oh, you could do so many cool things with this. And then like years later, I was like, oh man, what am I doing? But no, yes, subgenres and stuff like that, like,
It's
just
tough.
don't get me. And the big thing with, let's say, urban fantasy, just to quickly cycle back, is just that aesthetically it doesn't do anything for me.
I get that.
Like that's one of the reasons why I love, like, especially like period fantasy or medieval fantasy. You can even say specifically, classic high fantasy, is because the look of it is so kind of interesting and potentially like foreign and alien. You can have impossible geography and architecture and crazy creatures and clothes, and it's like everything. Like, you can just kind of go nuts with it,
Totally.
and it's just visually it's more stimulating seeing a dude in a shining armor with like a flaming sword than like oh, it's a guy in a trench coat with a gun.
Yeah, yeah, okay. I get it.
Cool.
I
Seen it.
Okay,
Seen
so
it.
oh, I've seen it. I've seen it all. I don't need to see any more. If Here's a question for you, and I just thought of it, and it may be a difficult question to answer, but
Mhm.
if you could see any like fantasy aligned media, so it doesn't have to be direct fantasy, it could be, like science fantasy, or like fiction, or even like horror, or like anything that kind of like you have to suspend the disbelief. If you could see any sort of film or franchise turned into an attraction at Universal Studios. So, like, they have Star Wars now, they have Harry Potter now. I think they have the Avatar world that's there as well. And what's the next big one, you think? Because for me, I have an answer, but I want to know what you think.
Ooh. Oh, okay. The next big one. Honestly, part of me is thinking like um, something. I'm surprised there's not a Super Mario World already.
Yeah, for sure.
Like you just you slide down these tubes and
Oh, that'd be cool.
like
Water park.
you have these little water park go karts
Totally.
going around. Um, people walking around as Goombas.
Mm-hmm.
Like that'd be fun.
That would be fun.
I'm surprised it's maybe it does exist somewhere else in the world.
It probably does. That's a Nintendo thing. Nintendo had to give up
Right.
licensing for all that stuff. For me, I think I would like to see a Blade Runner world. That would be dope. Uh,
Ooh, see, yeah,
just
that's like a cyberpunk world. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that sounds. See that, but I feel like that's like that caters to adults. See, like I guess I was thinking
Yeah.
of like what's something that like that you would take your family to go see because like
Right.
another thought I had just now was like, oh, like what if it was like a Marvel world
Mm-hmm.
and it was like you're walking down New York and it was like a stunt show kind of thing like in the old days with like cowboys except it's like Spider-Man
Ooh.
goes swinging down and
I think they have.
and
They've got a Marvel section in Universal. I think.
okay, well then, yeah. So basically, I was thinking something like that. But no, yeah, that what you described, that's I would want to go there.
I would go see
I would
that
want
so
to
fast.
imagine if it was constantly raining,
Yeah. Oh yeah. It would have to be.
and you could just walk up to like a little like Chinese like hot dog stand
Yep.
and order noodles.
Yes, yeah. Oh, it'd be so cool. And then you're sitting out in the patio and it's raining on you, and they hand you your complimentary trench coat, and you have to
Yep.
do your freaking like baseline test when you walk through the door. Like, oh yeah, it'd be
Yep.
great.
Oh man, and then you get you have the umbrellas with the lights in them.
Yep, yep,
I
absolutely.
like that. Yeah. Oh man. See, yeah.
See, we got to get this going.
Well, that's the thing is this whole recorded conversation thing. My plan is like I'm willing to expand into stuff like science fiction, especially if it's a little bit more fanciful, like Star Wars,
Yeah,
because fantasy is the overterm for all of this like sci-fi like because you always see in the store sci-fi fantasy.
Mhm.
It's like they're twins, they're sisters,
yep,
they're siblings, so
absolutely.
they go together, and so I'm fine with talking about that. But fantasy is my favorite between the two because it's more could potentially be more creative, really.
Yeah,
But no, that's I'd go to that.
totally.
Yeah,
So like
a beautiful world.
yeah, so colorful, vibrant, and like neon. I love it. And you could just have all these like displays everywhere that just do like random pattern generation that it would just be so cool.
Yeah.
Who are you
So
gonna do a conversation with next from our group?
I don't know. So I have a list of a bunch of topics, and what's hilarious to me is I saw this list of topics, and it's just huge.
Yeah.
And I realized after like sitting there for a second, like I came up with all these topics in a single sitting, just sitting here and like just like typing the next one, next one, next one. And so I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it up somewhere where everybody can see it,
Mm-hmm.
and then people can write in if they want to be in
I love
the
it.
conversation, like if they have something to say,
Nice.
or if they have another topic they can suggest. But yeah, I don't know. Might be talking to you next again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd
Um,
love to be back on.
but yeah, but like just wrap it up. I want to talk about like we both create stuff. but even you specifically have another podcast that is very creative.
Thank you.
And I want you to pitch that to all of my friends.
Okay, sure, yeah. Like I said, I'm Sean. I have been creating a universe for many years, about 12 years at this point. And the universe is a sword and sorcery world where there's a king who is in charge of this source of magic, and the source is very prolific, and has kind of, over the years that this grand kingdom has existed, spread and influenced the world around it. So the capital city is called Yin, and this city it has a sort of militia that is formed of members who live and reside within the walls of the city. And I run this podcast called Welcome to Amara, and Amara is the world that this city Yin is inside of. And the podcast follows my friend Andy. He is playing through a Dungeon World campaign that is set in this universe, and it is a fully produced audio drama. We've been doing it for about 2 years now. We are releasing episodes for season 2 currently. We have season 3 being produced right now, and season 4 is being played and written, all kind of simultaneously. We have plans to release at least 4 seasons, so you've got 2 more seasons to listen to ahead of this. There's about 11 episodes per season. If you want to check it out, you can visit our website, welcometoamara.com, and Amara is Amara. It's a blast. Andy and I have a lot of fun. We have a Discord server that we would love to have people come kind of chat and get more insight into fantasy and just talk about what they like. So if you enjoy the content on this podcast here, I think you'd probably fit right in with our Discord.
100%. Yeah, I really enjoy. I'm about to start the second season. Really enjoy listening to it. I especially love the evolution, the very vulnerable talking about, like, we're figuring this out, folks.
Yes.
Part aspect of it, but it's a fun story. It's interesting. And like, I've never done Dungeon World. I've only recently done Dungeons and Dragons, thanks to people like you. And so, like, this whole world of role playing games, like collective storytelling, is very cool indeed. But you don't just do that. You also make art and things.
I do,
because you're on the gram. Correct?
I am, yes. If anybody is interested in checking out my artwork, I am Misuse of Mana. And that's just my handle on Instagram. It's also my handle in a lot of other places. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitch, I think. I don't really use Twitch anymore, but I am on Twitch. Sometimes I'll do some streams.
I think I've looked at Twitch for other people. I've never done anything on it. I don't even know what I would stream. But yeah, definitely check out his art, folks, because it's very cool. I love the style of it.
Thanks, Dan.
It doesn't look like anybody else's.
I appreciate that,
and that's the fun part of it. It's always curious seeing, like, okay, how's he gonna interpret this? And it's never how I would, and that's why I like it. Is because it's like, I wouldn't even think of that.
That's awesome.
But yeah, thanks for talking about fantasy with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you certainly will be back to talk other things, because there's plenty of things to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
Trust me, when you see this list, you're going to laugh, because there's a bunch of shit in there. It's like, there's one that's like, is this a weird sex thing? Topic. And then I think, like, the next one down is weird sex thing.
Yep. It was confirmed.
Confirmed.
Yeah. Thank you a ton for having me on. I live for this kind of stuff. Conversation and just camaraderie is kind of my mantra. So I really appreciate being invited on. So thanks so much.
Sure. First guest, of course. So thank you, everybody who listened to this. And I'm just going to call it out. Thanks, Annie, for listening to this. I really appreciate it. You get a special shout out right now.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Annie. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye now.
That's good. That's good.